So here, to summarize, we've added our first map layer, of a dynamic map service layer, to the ArcGIS Server JavaScript API map. So we made our first ever JavaScript API map on Monday, and now we've added our first actual GIS layer to it, not just a base map. So we're coming along. I'm going to follow along on this screen. Any questions? So here's a screenshot of what we just saw, where the layers from the map service now appear in the map. Just like we saw on Monday how you could, I had told you that the JSON format would be critical in this, and you're starting to see that I meant it. When we created a new map on Monday, I remember I gave you the second, you can just say ESRI map and go with the defaults, but I added a second object that's a JSON formatted text string that had some options. And there's a lot of different options available. I think I showed you a screen on Monday of a lot of different options. The options that I picked were 3. The extent, and remember JSON is within curly brackets and they're value pairs with colon. So the first value pair is extent, a new geometry extent object. So that controls where the map opened to, roughly to Western New York, not exactly. Slider true, and the base map of National Geographic was set. I can now also make changes to, I can do the same thing, and this is true on a lot of different, maybe all, or almost all, creation or constructor requests in JavaScript API, where the second object would be a JSON string with additional options. If you remember, so it came up, it's kind of hard to see. In fact, I can't see anything. What's the point of having the National Geographic map? The municipality layer from Niagara County has completely obscured the map. Luckily, I can, one of the options for a feature service layer, so instead of just the URL, I can add a second JSON string, and one of the options is opacity. Opacity is a 0 to 1 number. The default is 0. It's completely opaque. You can't see through it. 1 you might not want to do either. It would be completely transparent. You would never see it. And I don't, just to show how you would do 2 objects or 2 settings in a JSON, I added visible true. It was already visible, so that really doesn't do anything. So now with this opacity 0.6, that is equivalent in ArcMap to setting a 60% transparency on the layer, like you might do in ArcMap. So now, see the difference. I can now see, I still see my zip codes and municipalities, but you can see the national, not as well on the screen, but trust me, you can see the National Geographic base map through the layer because it's 60% transparent. Couple other, and in a second, maybe after this slide, I'll bring up the different options for a dynamic map service layer. Another option I highlighted for you. It's always a challenge. I want to pick the things that I think are most useful. We would spend a lot more than 1 month going over all the different things you can do. So I'm picking things that I think will be the most benefit. Another thing you can do that I think would be useful to know is set visible layers. So in this example, you give it an array of numbers representing the IDs of the layers that will be visible. So So if I don't want all the layers on at startup, this is how I would control that. So 4 is zip codes. See that? So now when I view the map in the browser, I've seen it do that before where it kind of jumps away. I'm not sure why. Now only the zip codes are visible. The other layers are still there, but they're not visible. We can control that with set visible layers. I could make it an array. Let's turn on libraries and zip codes. This way. I think that should work. So now with 1, 4, the libraries and zip codes only are visible. Any questions? I can also, this is a good one, we can build in the equivalent of a definition query in ArcMap with the layer defs property. So layer defs would be defined as an array. So if you have, how would I explain this? We have 8 layers. If we wanted to build a layer defs capability on this map, you would create an array of layer defs with 8 items in it. You don't have to populate all of them, only the ones you need a definition query on. So in the slide, let's say the only one I'm interested in definition query on is the zip codes. I would populate layer defs 4. Remember, that's ID number 4 was the zip codes. But first I define the array and then set that one only, and then the map has a setting called set layer definitions. What is the constructor for that? Oh, it's just an array, that's right. And you can create an empty blank array. Unlike some programming languages, you don't have to predefine the size. So I'm just populating ID number 4, which would be the 5th item. And then set layer definitions 4. So what I've done here is I've created an array of layer definitions. I've populated just one of them, and then I use set layer definitions and then pass in that array. And just as a reminder that all of these are case sensitive, so it has to be lowercase s, capital L, and so on. So now we just see 14094. Oh. So that's how you would set layered. All of these things, I mean, I think it's worth pointing this out. I'm doing this in the init function on map startup. All of these things can be dynamically changed. So if your program needed to, focus on a different zip code, you could change the layer definition and refresh the map later. You're not stuck with 14094 forever. You can switch to a different Niagara County zip code. That's one of the advantages or beauties of this, of having the dynamic map service layers. Is you have access to those features, and can do those type of things. So a couple more slides. We're just about done with June 18th. We'll launch into the June 23rd lecture momentarily and take a break a little early. I think I saw, if you get hungry or thirsty, I am a little bit, the little store looks like it's now open until 8. I've wandered over there a couple times and it's like a complete dead zone. There's not another human soul over there when I've got, but I thought I saw in the store, if you want to go get a snack, that it's now open until 8 starting June 18th.
What store?
By the deli, is it that we call it now the deli, where they have the food court, and at the far end there's like a little convenience store. I think that's open, so maybe end a little before 8 if people want to go get a snack.
Will open?
Yeah, it said it was opening June 18th for summer hours.
Today?
Which I think is, I never know nowadays. I think today's June 18th, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I often don't. I'm lucky if I can tell you the year sometimes, some days. So maybe we'll take a break a little earlier if anyone wants to go grab a snack or something. These are long nights, especially when it's 2 nights a week. I just have a couple, as I said, we're mostly focusing on dynamic map service layers, and maybe you can see why. There's a lot more you can do with them. But just a couple slides and examples on tiled layer access. So I have here an example of a tiled map service layer where rather than dynamic features, we have a cache. And this is actually a useful one, I think. USA Topo Maps is a cache layer available. It's not one of the default base maps, but it's a cache layer of various USGS topo quads within the United States. And that's come in very handy for me on many projects. So you look at the REST endpoint, it looks a little different. Instead of seeing the features, we see a couple different things, and maybe I'll bring that up. So this location has services.arcgisonline.com. ArcGIS REST Services has all of ESRI's services. And I'm going to click on USA Topo Maps. And here's the service description. It's only got one layer, USA Topo Maps. It's got no pop-up and no statistics. Single fuse map cache true. That basically means it's just a series of tiles. And you can even see there's 16 levels of tiles, and you can see information about the tiled map extent. The lowest level they did is 18,000. Their JPEG format at quality 75 and so on. We'll talk more about spatial references probably very soon. It's the web Mercator projection that the base maps use. And this never works, but I'll try. It gives you the chance to look at the very first tile and the very last tile. Oh, that worked at that level. It's usually just ocean or something. It's probably in the Arctic somewhere. So if we wanted to add a tiled map service layer, we would do this in a very similar fashion. I'll create a variable USGS URL, and I would enter the REST endpoint. Exactly how you would with a dynamic map service layer. And like before, I would do a new Esri.layers but it's going to be an ArcGIS tiled map service layer, not dynamic. And I'll put one JSON string out in there for opacity. And add that layer. So you see that the procedure is very similar. You're just using a different class tiled map service layer. Did I do something wrong? ArcGIS Esri.layers, not layer. A good percentage of problems are typos. So now notice we have additional. Now we have the tiled layer and the libraries, and I zoom in, it actually switches to the different levels of topo quads that are available. We often get requests either of desktop maps or on online maps of having this as a base map, so that's a useful thing to add. I'm going to transition, maybe we'll talk for 5 more minutes and take our break, into the lecture that's labeled June 23rd. So the first thing we talk about is map extent. So we're starting to get deeper into the JavaScript API now. We can work with map extents in a variety of ways in the JavaScript API. With no extent defined in code, it defaults to whatever the extent was in ArcMap when you publish the map service. It kind of saves that in its properties. There's an extent object. There's a couple different things we can do. It's one of the properties of the map constructor. And I mentioned constructor a couple times. When you create a new object like this and give it properties off the bat, this is the constructor of that map. That's how we would term that. And notice I already did use extent. I defined it initially with the extent property on the map constructor. So that's one way of working with extent to define the initial extent. You can also set the extent later with the set extent property. We'll do some examples of that. We'll do that in a couple of examples we'll do in class and Lab 4. What Lab 4 is you'll build a web page where it has a map, and it seems silly, but it works. The user will put in the name of a state, a minimum, and a maximum population, and it will query every county within that population range, highlight them, and then zoom to those counties. So find every Ohio county with between 1 million and 2 million people. That's what you would do in Lab 4. And so obviously that zoom to extent after the selection is made is not an initial extent. You often need to change the extent later, and that can be done with this set extent. You can even set each element of this extent individually. So in our first example, we used it in the constructor. I showed you that a minute ago. Here's an example of using a connect. On Monday we talked about using Dojo connect to connect an event on an object to a function, either using dojo.connect or the on property. We'll do an example of that now. A map has an event called onExtentChange. So as the name implies, this you can write a function that runs every time the extent changes. So in this function we'll write in just a second, we will write a function in the onExtentChange that grabs the current extent and writes that out, just like in ArcMap when you scroll around the cursor and the current location of the cursor is updated. But in this case we'll show the map extent. So I will say dojo.connect. Remember that and the object is map, not map. Then we provide the object, or the event, excuse me, onExtentChange. And then we can write an anonymous function right here. So we've seen this structure before. So we're saying connect the map onExtentChange event to the following function. And you could name a function and then define it later, or by anonymous function, I mean, we can have a function with no name that's right there and then write the function immediately. So the function will be everything between these curly brackets. And on this event, it passes in the current map extent. So just like in the slide, I'm now going to say I'm going to build a string concatenating these different strings. And then I am going to use, we talked about the dojo by ID. And that's very important in the case sensitivity. And by ID, the I is the only thing capital. It's looking for a document object model, a tag, basically, with that ID. And I'm going to set its inner HTML. It's the first time we've done something like this. And let me back up and actually add that content. So when we defined the body of this HTML page last Monday, I just have one div tag, which is the map. We're now going to create another div tag just below that called chords. And it's empty, there's nothing in it. But now I have a div, a placer on the web page where I can write content. So you can grab a div using this tag using Dojo by ID, and there's a property called inner HTML. With this, I mean, we're just doing text, not HTML, but you can force new HTML content into a div with this inner HTML. So it could be more robust to this. You could write a table in there, images, a link, or anything using this inner HTML command. So I think I've written the script to do that, and I added the chords div tag to the HTML content. Let's new browser. Okay, and there we go. So now below the map, look what it's done. It wrote out the current extent in. Those coordinates look weird. That's the web Mercator. People familiar? That's a projection. I think ESRI's come up with it. It's a worldwide Mercator projection that's often used for worldwide layers that are on the web. Hence web Mercator. So if I zoom in, that's the onExtentChange property, and notice the numbers changed. So whenever the extent is changed, the on extent change event runs, because we connected it with Dojo.connect, and it got the new extent. Any questions?